Thank you for that. Thank you. Smart, but like not smart enough to know that to be on that side of the stage when you're about to come on. Hi everyone. Good morning. I'm really happy that this is happening. Not happy because of the topic, but because we're all in this room talking about it, and that there's a bunch of smart people, particularly who are architects or architecture adjacent, who care about this problem. In the run-up to this, I was looking back at some of the stuff I've written about the housing crisis or affordability and all that, and it's kind of been my entire writing career of 20 years or so, especially the last 12 years writing a column in the Toronto Star, affordability just kept coming up and up and up. It's like one of the things, it's like the thing of city life that makes city life possible or increasingly impossible. So this big conversation that it's happening is heartwarming to me, because for a while it felt like, not that I was prescient or anything, but it was my job to look for problems as a columnist. And housing was a problem for a long time, but it was really hard to convince people that it was a problem. If people are comfortable, if you have your house, if you have your kind of solid mortgage, whatever, it's hard to see the precarity for a lot of other people. But slowly over the last few years, probably only the last 5 or 6 years, I've noticed that parents are beginning to notice that their kids aren't going to have the same kind of housing opportunities that they did, or possibly, if they're boomers, their grandkids. They're sort of seeing it within their own family, that the way that they got homes is not going to be the same. There's this kind of pernicious myth that the playing field is the same as it was, say, in 1973, when my parents bought their house in Windsor. I'm from Windsor, for $29,000, a kind of typical 1969 split level, big yard, and that sort of thing. When my mom sells it, eventually, it's certainly not going to go for $29,000. But they were 26 years old, buying their first house that they lived in for their whole life, and that is sort of like the Canadian dream that doesn't really exist anymore. I think it's also really good that we're here in Niagara Falls, because a lot of the time Toronto gets the kind of bulk of the conversation. I mean, it is the most expensive. It was sort of, I mean, growing up in Windsor, like housing prices in the 80s in Toronto, people would say, "Oh, this house went for $200,000," and we'd be like, "Oh." So Toronto was sort of like a meme for expensiveness before there were memes, but now that's spread to Windsor. Windsor has its own affordable crisis. Small towns across Ontario have their own affordability. So it's not just a Toronto problem. It's an Ontario problem. I was this morning, last night when I got in, looking out the window at the falls, because it's still amazing to look at that thing, but looking beyond the falls at New York State, thinking about how another place does it, how America doesn't necessarily have the same dynamics that we have, so it's kind of an interesting place to have this conversation. As well, I just kept looking out, like upriver, and you could see the landscape where Love Canal is. There's probably enough people in the room that remember Love Canal. As a Gen Xer, I grew up the sort of boogeyman of Love Canal, which was the housing, post-war housing project that was built on contaminated land that all had to be torn down, and there were all kinds of terrible problems from it. And it made me think last night and this morning that we need to be fast, we need to build, we need to find housing for people, but then it put this little kind of bit of caution in my head that like maybe too fast isn't always the answer. So how do we be fast but also thoughtful? So it's thoughtful but also well designed, which is why it's great that architects are involved in this, because sometimes it seems like affordable housing, truly affordable housing, sometimes has to be cheap, and I think we'll talk about that today. One last thing about this, we're going to have a conversation here. It's going to later open up to your questions. I'm looking forward to having it in person. My general experience of the housing conversation is on social media, where it is the most vicious battle that you have ever seen. It's probably one of the reasons I left Twitter. You wouldn't think it. It's like housing, good. But the solutions for housing are almost kind of encampments, battling each other, an ideological battle about housing. It's been kind of really strange and interesting evolution of this conversation over the last 5, 6, 7 years. So it's really nice to have it in person and have it kind of more thoughtful. The one thing I do know is that no one solution is going to solve this thing. We need a kind of all hands on deck, all ideas on deck, a war effort on housing. Last night I went for a 15-kilometer walk to like the old downtown of Niagara Falls, past the tourist part and back, and I kind of saw all these different layers of Canadian housing, Ontario housing, from like the pre-war Victorians, but then the slab apartments that were subsidized by CMHC in the 60s and 70s, and some of those kind of bungalows from the post-war era. And we did have a post-war effort at housing, and maybe that's what we need now. So we have some great warriors, I guess, to talk about housing today. And our first speaker will be John Van Nostrand. He's the director of Two Step Home, CEO of Parcel Developments, and the founding partner of SVN Architects and Planners. Since 1978, he has been the driving force behind the firm's integrated architectural planning, landscape, and urban design practice. In 2018, he created Parcel to focus on evolutionary housing and its application to entry-level housing for all incomes. Most recently, John created Two Step Homes to address homelessness more directly. John?
Good. Short guy. So I call this talk "The Endless Incompletion of the City," which is actually a quote from one of my great teachers called Antoine Grumbach. Some of you will know his work in France. But he talks about the city, and of course the city for him is Paris, which we thought was always fixed, for example. It's always changing. They just added 180,000 new units there before the Olympics on top of the city that existed. So I think it's such an interesting topic. And one of the reasons it changes is that there's a lot of immigration. And we know that now. But this has been happening for a long time, or relatively long time for Canada. So you can see that what this shows is the peak that happened around 1912 and is pretty much equal to the peak we're having right now. And you can see the changes in between. So it's always, and it is again, a huge issue for us of how to deal with immigration. And what it did, I will follow on and say that prior to 1945, immigration was largely British. It was all the poorest people of the UK who got sent over here so they didn't have to deal with them there. And others as well. And they lived in what's called now the unplanned communities that were built. They built in a very different way up to 1945. And that was followed by, in 1945, by the official plan for Toronto, which was quite the opposite, and its goal was to make sure nothing changed that was built. It was called a fully planned approach, and I'm going to show that it wasn't fully planned at all. It was a disaster. So there is the 1945 plan, and I think it's interesting because so it's very much based on the 1943 plan for London, England. Very much the same approach that they took to London, UK, which was to put a green belt around the old city and propose 7 garden suburbs based on actually Ebenezer Howard's original idea that a maximum community should be about 35,000 people. So you can see that in each of those, this even uses the graphics that Howard used in 1892 to describe those communities. So you can see the 35 to 45,000 spread across. And the other important part of it was you didn't just build the new housing, you actually went in and condemned all the housing, the oldest housing that was, and you demolished it. And that was the brown blocks that are across there, which you will now know are Regent Park. Regent Park, Canada, of course, is a Regent Park in London as well. And it was also demolished and reconstructed in a very similar way. So, and this model was not only just adopted, it was actually copied by British planners. And we had British planners in Toronto continually up to 1972. And they carried the message with them, and they took it to all the provincial capitals. And most provincial capitals have a very, very similar plan, varied somewhat. Eugene Faludi, that's the guy I was trying to remember earlier, who was actually Hungarian, but was the first person who incorporated subways into the plans for Budapest. And he came to England, he worked on the 43 plan, introduced the tube, introduced the subway in Toronto. So these are this is sort of an image of the two communities, as I call it. Unplanned communities is a term. I refer to a book that, if you haven't read it, which is called The Unplanned Suburbs of Toronto, and is a history of what happened up to 1945. But there's a typical view of what was happening in Toronto along the first subway lines that went out to the first three big businesses: Goodyear Tire, Kodak, and then Ford had a plant in the east side of the city. So you can see that by 1945, 40 to 60% of all households in Ontario cities, and by the way, of every other city in Canada, maybe varied even to 80%, had built their own homes. But you can see what that meant. I mean, it meant that some people were just building shacks. You can see outhouses, but you can see sort of builders at the back there, and even in the front, but who were in building row houses already among all this. So it had a very high level of housing affordability. The lower is just a glimpse of Don Mills, the actual first garden suburb that was built out. And it was planned not to change, which meant that housing was only affordable to really 35% of the population. And so the question is, what was the model for what to do in Canada? And it was post-war, and one of the schemes, and people have coming back, Canadian planners and architects had been looking at post-war Europe and came back, and somebody said, hey, in Stockholm, they cleared 6 clearings, they put a train to them, and they built these things called high-rise towers by some guy called Le Corbusier, because he liked working class people, and he knew how to build for them. So that's the model for Vallingby. That's the picture of existing, which was one of the 6 work centers. He suggested, this planner, that we could use some kind of approach like this in Toronto, and he went to E.P. Taylor, who was looking for ideas, and said, because what had happened is two of the people who moved in lived in the red area and were manufacturing something. They said, we love Don Mills. We bought our houses here. Our senior managers have bought their houses here, but we need 100 people to run our production line. So we're going to have to take a bus down to Regent Park and pick up our labor because they can't afford to live here. The lowest house was only affordable to the top 35% of the population. So this was his answer that he came up through the design process, the planning process. And I've been to this place, and it's very much like the lower place here. That is, what he did is they said to Mr. Taylor, why don't you take your racetrack, Thorncliffe Park, and put Vallingby, Sweden in there? And that is Thorncliffe Village now, Thorncliffe Park, as you know, which is below. So in the end, what was really happening, when I say they made a mistake or they forgot the fully planned system, really forgot 65% of the population. And that's what we're feeling right now out there. Still feeling. And we've got another huge load coming. So I think this is really the interesting, really important, really exciting. And I think we're tired of British solutions. I kind of think we're a very, very successful British colony. partly because we don't even know we've been colonized. We think, oh, it's just the First Nations got. No, we got planned to death right here. And this model has really caused the problems we're living with today. And you can see that Thorncliffe Park was not only just not, it was part of Don Mills, but it was not doing within walking distance of the center. And then we have the really amazing work by David Holchansky. So he's a person who mapped incomes each census period, and then he mapped them out. Red was poor or getting poorer, blue was rich or getting richer, and yellow was middle income. So in 1970, you can see the situation of the city is that poverty, the poorer people in the old city and the edges of that, and that was just sort of a point when Don Mills was finished, the construction of it. By 2005, this was the situation in terms of the balance between poverty, those who are getting poorer, those who are getting richer, and those who are in the middle. And you'll see that there's a pretty big correspondence with that red area and the official plan, because it's full of towers, for one thing, which now even the wealthy have taken to, ironically. So again, so I just want to talk about then too a couple of things that we've been working on, sort of address this idea of the endless incompletion. This was the first invasion in Toronto in 2002, where over 300 or so, 300 or 400 homeless person occupied it one night, and we ended up they were asking us to make a plan for them. And I went to Jack Layton. I said, Jack, we got to do this. And he said, well, where are they going to live? And we built this cabin. It was the very first thing we did. And that became a model for others to build housing. And just when we had the plan done, and by the way, I went into City Hall and did it in City Hall so I could prove that for the housing portion of welfare, that was $350, you could own that house. You could carry a mortgage of $30,000, and you could really make use of that work you're getting from workfare. And that led us into, there's the little house in the corner, but led us into some other solutions, and this is one of them, which now is very much in play, and we're working on a project that does exactly this. Basically, you can see the little house. That's where you come in the beginning, and you can store your stuff and live there while you build the house in front of you. And the house is 400 square module. That you can see it's repeated. It's split level. So what happens is you can move into the house. You can even rent half of it if you need that to carry it. But when you're ready, you can go up to half level at the back and build the next layer, and vice versa. And you can do that 4 times up to 2,000 square feet, which is the final one. So, and that could be done, I think I've got it. And there's a way, that's an analysis of the cost of that housing. If it was built for you, 2 is if you built 50% of it, and 3 is if you built it yourself, because you can do it. It's flat packs of 400 square feet. And you can see that the reduction and the impact of rental on owning. We've got ourselves into a huge trap of, if you're poor, you rent, and if you're rich, you own. Well, it's malarkey. Rich people got rich by renting. And we're just starting, we reintroduced rooming houses now. What? Because that's how the people paid for their big house that they were in and took it over eventually. And then one final thing here. I'm sorry I'm taking too long here, but this is another idea for a sort of taller building, and I bought a piece of land and said, hey, we could try and build this thing on it. We didn't, because it's another story, but we are about to in another location a number of years later. And basically, I'm sorry, it has to do with just dividing the floor plate into lots. And the lots are all the same size, and their size depends on your analysis of the neighborhood. And we spent 2 years in this neighborhood, the north end of Hamilton, seeing what was affordable to them as a basic entry point. And it was $500 per month rent. That's how you could live here. So that's the split up. You can see that there are stacks for the services, and then roughly one lot. We used a 250 module, so it's like a studio, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bed, roughly, depending on the number of lots you use. And there's an example of the building, which inspired me, which is in Hamburg, and really, really interesting and sort of somewhat similar. And there's a sort of drawing of the typical floor plate with the blue is the corridor, of course. And that's an analysis. We provided the lots in 3 different ways. 2 different ways. One is basic. It was legally occupiable. You wouldn't be kicked out, but you got to finish it yourself and you paid a little less. Or it's built for you. So it's turnkey is what we call it. So that's just an example of the spectrum of opportunities for people and their incomes. And you can see that the red is the cost of the unit. That's 3 years ago. And the red is the income of the people you're trying to attract, and the black above it is the cost of the unit. And there's how those options spread over a full range of incomes from basically people on workfare, ODSP, right through to $120,000. And that shows how that can be occupied. So it's not just the community is forever changing, it's the buildings that have to change as well. So I think the biggest challenge we have is how do we design buildings that can change and grow and expand and contract as we age, and our family composition changes and our ages change. And that's sort of an example of just the basic start, where you start with 2 of the unplanned, the simple parcels, the basics, and build up your unit over time. And that's the building. And I'll let you know when it gets built next time. Thanks.
Thanks, John. One of the great things about writing about this stuff is that there's such a rich archive and current activity in Ontario, in this hyper-regulated province that we live in with grand plans, 100 years of grand plans at least. I go to the Toronto Reference Library and Robarts Library at U of T and just go to the urban area and just row after row after row of stuff to dig into. It's an incredibly rich place to live and work. We're very lucky up here because we have a couple architects. We also have builders. We have a mix of the designers and the people that are putting them up, and they kind of overlap at the same time. So our next speaker is Christian Huggett. He's the managing director and head of development at Podium Developments, and the company's leader in all things design. He steers the firm through site acquisition and project stabilization, development and design trends, site and building layout, municipal approvals, and sales and marketing. Prior to joining Podium, Christian was a planning, urban design, and architecture consultant for several Toronto-based firms. Christian.
I'm a little taller. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming. And as Sean mentioned, I have the pleasure of working in a number of areas in planning, urban design, and architecture, and now I am working in development. We were asked this question about, housing affordability and what roadblocks are in the way. And I thought about how to address this, and I apologize in advance. I'm based in Toronto, so this is a Toronto case study, but I think you're going to see some parallels from wherever you are. I started this and said, what if I just took a walk around and thought about something that maybe sticks out? And this is how I started thinking about this. This is near my neighborhood, the Danforth area. And I've been watching this building go up, this building that's 6 stories under construction. It's been going up for a while, it was hoarded for a while, it was under condo sales for a while. And I'm literally at the gate to Broadview subway station, looking across the street. On the right is a streetcar turnaround that integrates the 2 areas together. And then in behind there's several 70s era tower blocks in behind. Those who know that area would maybe be familiar driving on DVP. You might see these towers up, similar to what John was talking about, Thorncliffe Park, et cetera, where there was towers residual. This was, I think, a blockbusting effort at that time, but there's sort of this residual fabric. But I was focused more on the building in the front. And I asked myself, why is there a 6-story building going up opposite a subway, especially now? So I did a bit of a deep dive, and I'm not related to this project. It's not ours. I don't know this developer at all. But went back and through city council, community council, planning development applications online, and said, what is this building? Okay, it's 6 stories. It's 20 meters plus a penthouse. It's about 3.5 times, which is, as a target for density is reasonable. But then you start looking at the scale of the project itself. It's 33 units, has 48 parking spaces. It's about 30,000 square feet of GFA. And this is from weeks ago. It's under construction. It's 100 meters literally from Broadview Station. Some other key stats, when I went back and said, well, I've been looking at this site for a long time. It seems like a long time in my mind. And went back and looked at entitlements. So entitlements alone took almost 4 years. Permits and early works took 2.25 years. Construction started, excavation started. I used Urban Toronto and looked at photos dated, we're digging here, congratulations, September 2022. Based on my knowledge of building buildings, I assume the earliest occupancy would be in the summer of 25, which would be about 3 years construction. And so a total timeline of almost 12 years. I said to myself, well, that's an insane amount of time for that small a project. Why are they doing 6 stories? So I went back and looked at the planning framework, because I can't help it. This is a lot of what governs what gets built in our cities and our towns. And so on the right in D is the zoning, the current zoning map. The blue square is the site. You can see the Danforth sort of running diagonally and the Don Valleys on the left. Then I looked at there is the Broadview Urban Design Guidelines, which were done in 2016. And so what's interesting is Broadview and Danforth are designated as mixed-use area, and are there's an avenue overlay, which is meant to suggest an idea about where we might intensify. I'm sure Namo's going to talk, she's talked a lot about the yellow areas in our official plans, which are essentially areas we don't touch or considered stable. But the red areas are areas we're promoting to intensify. There's bus, there's subway, there's et cetera. So this would probably be consistent with a lot of areas you might work in or live in, where we're concentrating and trying to promote intensification near transit corridors. So this, as I mentioned, I was standing in that picture basically where that green triangle is in the top left image. The subway is right next door. Then I looked at the urban design study, the urban design guidelines themselves, and they identify these character areas. We're in character A. And then I looked and saw that there was a very probably familiar to us sort of mid-rise sculpting shape a section which shows, essentially from the front there's an idea about scale on the street and an angular plane applied into the lot. And on the back, most importantly, there's an angular plane applied from the back to suggest transition. So this is from the back. I went one road behind on Broadview, and I'm calling this the view that often defines what we build. And looking from my developer perspective, I said, okay, what is going on with this building? I mentioned some of the stats. What are the key metrics, and would they make sense right away? For my opinion, I would never build this kind of building. I'd never go forward with the scale of it because it's 33 units only. So typically, you're looking for buildings to operate at a scale and sort of undergo the same amount of work. The amount of work for this is the same as a building that's 200 units, 300 units. So 33 units. Now that's not to say we can't have sensitive infill scale buildings. I'm not suggesting that, but I do think 33 units across this street is unfortunate. It has an inefficient and a very expensive floor plate based on these stepping. It's significantly overparked, 48 spaces for 33 units, which adds at least $5 million currently in the current context for construction. It's a small, I mentioned operating, it's very expensive per square foot for maintenance of this kind of scale building. There's not that many units to pay for it. The entitlements took almost 4 years and it did not have an appeal. So if you imagine the time to carry a site, now they're coming up on 12 years, but even in entitlements, if it takes 4 years, and that's not including an appeal process, which a lot of us might be familiar with, can delay another 1 to 2 years. It's a cost right away. And I mentioned the timeline of development, plus 11 years. So my conclusion was not a surprise. It's significantly underdeveloped relative to the location, less than 100 meters from the subway. But I think this view is something that has permeated. I was working in planning consulting for a long time, and was coming up against these things and still come up against these things. This idea about transition and, dogmatic approaches to how we govern, that this house in the front that's 100 meters from a subway is dictating what we can build when we have a crisis and when we need more housing is to me is asinine. So when I zoom out, there's the building in the foreground and we're looking at the city. And you can see those 70s towers in the back. And that's the Bloor Danforth subway in the red line. It goes across the valley. But when you pivot 180 degrees, you look at the Danforth. And the Danforth, not surprisingly, is sterilized, partly because of small, shallow lots. So they can't, when you apply an angular plane, you basically can build hardly anything above it. That red circle is the new Ontario line coming up. So those who might know, there's a new subway being built coming up and connecting to Danforth at Pape. At that circle, there actually is one application for a tall building, and it does stick out. But you think about that circle, that's the new Yonge and Bloor. 2 subway lines intersecting. We have to reevaluate some of our systematic planning documents, our thoughts around transition and what makes sense and what is the governing bodies to and regulations to control development, because I'm not suggesting we should do whatever we want and that the problem or the issue should usurp all of the fine considerations that have gone into our work to date. But I do think this is such a glaring example of things that we're running into as developers, as architects, as planners, every day, that we need a systematic change. So I'm going to leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah, the Toronto ziggurat that is one of those kind of housing kind of memes, bête noire of the housing conversation online anyway. And in my mind, it's like the buildings are kind of genuflecting towards all the homeowners as a lapsed Catholic, because homeowners have all the power and they're the ones that get to decide who lives there and who doesn't live there, which might be something we discuss shortly here. Our next presenter, Namra Blonder, is an architect, urban designer, and planner. Her professional practice at Smart Density combines the discipline of architecture, urban planning, and urban design to bring deeper, more realistic understanding of how cities can address housing affordability and champion inclusive neighborhoods with more equitable access to housing. A frequent lecturer, she is known for her work in transit-oriented, missing middle, and livable communities. Nama?
Can I get this? Oh, perfect, it's working. Okay. Well, thank you for having me, and thank you, Christian, for this presentation. I couldn't ask for a better presentation before my presentation. I am very fortunate to get to speak on this type of panels a lot. And every time I have people approaching me after the panel or presentation and say to me, you know, Toronto is dense enough. It's time for us to start directing people somewhere else. We are just maxed out. And recently I even had some fellow panelists, not these guys, other panelists, saying the same things publicly on these type of stages. And I find it very problematic to say and even think that way. So I came back to the office after one of those panels, and I asked myself, is Toronto really maxed out? I felt like I knew the answer, but I asked my team how much room there is for more people in Toronto. So at least the next time I'm hearing people telling me we are densed out, we're maxed out, it's time for us to start sending people somewhere else, especially newcomers. So I would know. I wanted to know, what is the capacity? And specifically, the technical question that I raised was how much underutilized land there is near transit. And the focus is near transit, and that's why I said Christian's presentation was the perfect presentation for me. So I'm going to walk you through some of the assumptions that we did in this research. I only have 5 minutes. I excluded some of those assumptions. I'm happy to share. We will get this published, and I'm happy to answer any questions that I will not cover here today. But basically, we said we have two types of transit in the city. The rapid, which is GO, LRT, and subway, and the frequent, which is the buses that come every 10 minutes, and the streetcar. By the way, this is both from the official plan. The city also has this hierarchy identified in the official plan. The second thing we said, okay, so how are we going to identify this? So we said, let's work with an inner circle and outer ring. For the rapid, the GO, the subway, and the LRT, we'll take a 400-meter radius and an 800-meter radius, and for as the outer ring, and for the frequent transit, which is the bus and streetcar, we'll take a 250 meters as the inner circle and 400 meters as the outer ring, as the area that we are thinking of that is appropriate to intensify. Now, this is exactly what Christian said, because there are 4 colors in the land use map of the official plan. 2 of them, the pink and the orange, mixed use and apartment neighborhoods, this is where the city currently identifying the growth, where growth should go. But there are 2 colors, yellow and purple, 2 shades of purple, employment and neighborhoods, where the city says no growth should be there. Now, I know recently they said garden suite, multiplexes. For a city like Toronto, this is still mean no growth. and employment, that the city is somewhat obsessed with employment land, that to have no residential uses on them. And remember, we are in proximity to transit. So the Ontario line that Christian mentioned cost the taxpayer $25 billion. But we still have yellow properties in direct proximity to this investment that all that they could have is a single family house, maybe a garden suite, and maybe a triplex. That's it. And then we said, okay, let's exclude from this, this area, the land, anything that is greater than 2, the FSI. So 2 or 1.25. And the assumption was that everything that is kind of already, not tall, but FSI 2 is a decent density, it will be very hard to develop. So we excluded all of those buildings that are already higher than this FSI. And then we called our friend Ratio City, and I really want to take advantage and thank them because yeah, it was long, but we asked them for this data. So we gave them all these parameters and say, can you, from Ratio City, it's a GIS platform, and we asked them, can you give us an accurate number of square kilometers for this data? There are 273 square kilometers that follow what I mentioned, near transit, the inner circle, outer ring, and the land use that we are restricting and not restricting. And from that, so this is the land use map. I just wanted to make sure that we have it here. But we wanted to create a new land use map, a new map that we called the map of welcoming more homes and residents in Toronto, and take all of this and propose a new way to look at how we build near transit. And this is our map. So what you see here is mostly 4 colors, but also parks and open spaces. And then we called the white the rest of Toronto. But we basically said inner ring and outer circle. And to respect the needs of employment and its importance in the city, we said, okay, we will have land with higher employment uses, but it will still be opened up to residential uses. Because remember, all of it is near transit, all of it. And then I assume that I won't have the time to really walk you through how we got into the calculation of how many, but I will share a few models that we did. But I can tell you that in our build form or assumptions, we did count for a larger average size of units. So we didn't take the average currently market. We believe that it does not reflect the needs of our diverse communities. We also took a much higher percentage of what the city called parkland dedication, so open space in proximity to those new developments and transit. So we exceeded the guidelines today. And in our calculation, we got into the number that there's more than the capacity in Toronto is still more than 7 million homes to welcome new residents. So my hope is that the next time each of you will hear that Toronto is maxed out and we're dense enough, you will actually say, that's not true. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nama. Definitely a Toronto conversation, but happening elsewhere. We just saw the last few weeks, Calgary was having this very bitter debate in City Hall about upzoning the entire city. Windsor, my sister lives in the neighborhood, Walkerville, where the entire neighborhood kind of went upside down because there was a 3-story little apartment building planned over the last couple years. So happens in Toronto, happens in smaller places, happens all over. Our final speaker this morning is Robert Boyd. He's an architect and senior construction manager of development for Toronto Community Housing Corporation. His role there sees him leading TCHC's design and construction interests in the revitalization of Regent Park in downtown Toronto, including procuring all design consultants. Prior to joining TCHC in 2019, Robert worked for 23 years at a number of architecture firms. Robert?
Thank you. I don't know if my microphone is working. Apologies to those who aren't from Toronto. My graphs here are all Toronto-based. I want to talk about affordability. My view, my presentation, or my talk is a little bit contrary to what everybody else has spoken about earlier. Affordability is typically understood by government agencies like TCHC, the City of Toronto, governments at all levels across the country, in common parlance, in the press, and so on. Affordability is generally understood as something that housing is designed or intended to be. Ideally, we would spend about 30% of our gross household income on housing. And that's what we generally consider to be affordable. So I want to talk about that. So this graph is average household income in Toronto from 1976 to 2021. And you can see that there has been a slow but steady increase in average income over this almost 50-year period, 45 years. Just for fun, I also graphed increases in minimum wage in Ontario, just to put all of this in perspective. You can see that if you were earning minimum wage for the past 50 years, your income would have gone up extremely little. These, by the way, are all adjusted for inflation. Putting them on the same graph, minimum wage in the past 50 years has gone up less than 20%. Average household income in Toronto, 32%. Fairly modest increases. Again, this is all adjusted for inflation. Housing prices, though, have done this. And the growth over the past 50 years has been almost exponential and getting worse. Toronto Real Estate Board recently reported that Q1 this year, first quarter increase in housing in Toronto, year to year has gone up 5%. Most people are not getting 5% wage increases over last year. Put those two lines on the same graph and this is what you get. The bottom green line is average household income. The blue line is average housing price rise. Now in 1976, the ratio of price to income was about 3. So average household price was about 3 times what an average household earned in a year. It's now almost 10. So in my view, I'm not sure that we have a housing crisis so much as we have an income crisis. Why is this green line so flat? Many economists will have linked the flatness of that line to the flatness of Canadian productivity. And I'm not enough of an economist to be able to explain the ins and outs of that. But I do know from my work at TCHC that bringing this blue curve down back to where it was in 1976, 3 times average household income, I don't really believe that it's possible. The work that I do at TCHC involves building multi-unit residential buildings that have typically 200 to 250 units in them. To be clear, TCHC does not sell its units. We build rental units. And we build them with price advantages that a typical developer doesn't have. So for example, we don't pay development charges to the city. We are an agency of the city. So that would be like us giving money to the city that they're just going to give back to us. So we don't pay development charges. We pay a modicum, barely any HST on our construction costs. We build mostly on land that we already own, so we don't have land costs. And we get favorable rates on on interest on our construction loans. So our costs are already pretty low compared to what another developer might typically pay. And yet, if we were to sell a unit, again, we don't, but if we were, we would have to be able to sell a unit so that a purchaser would only pay 30% of their household income on that unit, we would have to reduce our construction prices by about 30%. A typical developer that doesn't have those advantages and has to pay for land and HST and so on and so forth would have to reduce their costs by about 60%. And I don't think that that's possible. And I can tell you that my work at TCHC, it's not possible for us to reduce our costs by 30%. We build good housing, and we do it for as little money as we possibly can. We build housing that is durable because we own our buildings in perpetuity. So we have a high quality of construction, but reducing our cost by 30% just is not going to happen. How to bridge that divide between those two lines is something that I think, I don't believe that there's an architectural or even a short-term policy alternative solution to. So yes, we can build more, which will, I think, only serve to solve a short-term supply issue. We can build faster, maybe, but I think that that risks increasing prices even more. In 2021, we started construction on a building in Regent Park. The concrete form worker, a contractor, needed a crane. There wasn't one to be had. He had to purchase one in Germany and have it shipped over. That's in 2021. And so now if we're talking about building faster, I think that prices are only going to increase. We can build more densely, yes, and we should do that. But I don't know that those policies alone are going to bring that blue curve all the way back down to where we're only paying 30% of our household income on housing. So what do? Maybe we have to rethink what affordability means. I'm sorry to be the harbinger of bad news. Thank you.
Bad news, but maybe we'll find some rays of hope with all this talent on the stage. Robert, I wanted to ask you, like, with that in mind, that how hard it is to build in this environment where affordability is almost impossible. But I wanted to switch it because we're in a room with designers to talk about quality. And I was talking to Alex Bezikovic, who is the architecture critic for the Globe and Mail, which is some small newspaper. And I don't know if you're allowed to say his name in a room of architects, but anyway, he said Robert is the one who made quality-based procurement a thing at TCHC. In my mind, one of the most important moves for architecture in recent Ontario history. So how do you advocate for quality design, quality architecture in such a tight environment, and why does it matter?
Well, quality design and quality architecture don't necessarily cost more. On the contrary, it can cost less. I don't think that the two are married to each other. So, yes, at TCHC, we adopted a new policy of procuring services of engineers and architects. We select first on their qualifications. When we have found the team that we believe the best team that we can find for our projects, we'll then start to negotiate a price and we'll tweak the scope of services to suit. But we don't, at the same time, we demand high quality design, superlative service, and we have found so far that it doesn't cost us more. It doesn't increase the cost of the housing. So I think that there's a common misperception that qualifications-based selection will reduce in higher costs, and it doesn't. And even if it did, remember, we own our buildings in perpetuity. And so at the end of the day, if we own a building for, let's say, 100 years, well, over the life cycle of that building, what we'll have paid the architects and the engineers will be this much of the cost of that building.
Nama, you talked, Toronto's full, Windsor is full, Niagara Falls is presumably full. That endless kind of hitting the wall of residents saying, no, too much. How do we get over that? It just seems like it comes from conservative neighborhoods, it comes from the most lefty neighborhoods. I think if there's anything that pulls the two spectrums of politics aside, it's being anti-housing sometimes. How do we get over that?
It's an excellent question. Sometimes I feel like it's our industry's fault that we almost arm the public with the buzzwords that they could say and will be successful with decreasing housing, like shadows. It's a word that we gave them, right? It's not a word that come from the public. And there's something in the planning system here that allows, not only that allows you to live in a single family home by a subway, it also, our planning system allows you to dictate that there's nothing in a greater density next to you. And that, we think it's democracy, we think it's, it's not. We're missing a lot when we are giving a lot of power to the 1% that attends the open house, or so it's not so much. I don't put it on the public. I really put it on us as the industry that plays it wrong, and there's a lot that we could do.
Yeah, I'm thinking about so many of those public meetings where often some poor junior architect or planner is up there against the most hostile, audience. I mean, some of the recent ones in Toronto have just been like people have left in tears, which is kind of depressing. So, John, you had a thought?
I would say that we need neighborhood growth plans, that we need the neighborhood, and I don't know, I mean, it could be, I think there's 40 in Toronto and there's 16 in Hamilton, but maybe it's a couple that get together, but they get a say. We get to know who lives there, we get to know their income, we get to know what our target, what their proportion of growth should be, and they plan for that with the city. I mean, the city is guiding. They couldn't possibly. I mean, honestly, that last building I showed was after we did a neighborhood growth plan first, and what I mean is we talked to everybody, and just as an example, and we said these are the other neighborhoods that are like this, so we're not just wasting our time here. These findings, and I think you'll see. For instance, I'd like to know what the unbuilt envelope, the area of the unbuilt envelope that exists, what is shown to the public. My neighborhood, pretty middle sort of road, but we had somebody come in and build once a sort of 4-story sort of monster home. There, it was actually 5-story, and they came to the residents, my neighbors came and said, hey, what do we do about this? I said, I'll look at it. Oh, it's as of right. What do you mean it's as of right? Well, it means that every one of these buildings here could be that high. And I think we worked in that neighborhood. We worked out that if you built out the unbuilt volume, you'd equal the growth that's planned for that part of the city.
So doing the kind of grassroots work of working with the neighborhood might be the secret. And I'm thinking this might be a good time to talk about like Ontario's recent plans of sort of top down, every city is going to be denser, whether or not that's going to happen or not, is a good question. How do you see, like, and Calgary's, that's a debate going on in Calgary right now, like we're going to rezone the whole thing and as of right. How do we balance that we need to do things at a big scale, the war effort scale, like we did in the 60s and 70s, but avoid the blockbusting, avoid angry neighbors. How do we negotiate that path?
Well, again, I think, just end a little bit, but people don't know anything about planning. Mm-hmm. And how would they? It's just totally confusing, and they know that these guys can get somebody. It's also interpretable and vague that they're going to get whatever they want eventually, and we don't know the people. We don't know who they are and what their income is and what do we have to build here. And that's because planning I am speaking as a fellow of the CIP, we've got to change it dramatically. And we got to do that on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis.
Yeah, I was just gonna, you stole a lot of what I was, like, planning affects every single person in this province in some way, and no one knows about it. The profile of planning, which is something that I think planners need to work on, but everyone in the adjacent sphere, developers, architects, we're all governed by planning. Planning is how land is used, simply, and the rules we put in place to shape that. And you know, I talk to my neighbors who might be speculating on something happening near our homes, and half the time I have to decide if I want to educate and risk an argument,
Losing your
right? Or just kind of go, well, you know, that's the system we're in, you know. So it's, I think that, you know, I was saying that as well, the systematic problem we have around excess control, lack of input, and the fact that, you know, the way we consult generally based on the Planning Act rules, based on how we do things, people get involved because they believe they have something negative. It's affecting them all, but they're looking at it as a way to, like, no one comes to a public meeting and says, "You're doing a great job, I wish you did more," or boy, you know, like, if we could figure this out, I'm really concerned about this, but you know what, I think a couple more stories would be great if we could maybe get some affordable housing. And you know, I think as a developer would absolutely consider that, right? So, but we don't have those kind of avenues for dialogue and discussion, and that's why I think it's been so frustrating for a while, is that it affects everyone, but no one talks about it except in a negative way. And we need to reverse that.
Not to mention that you ask us about community, let's call it community engagement. There's a fundamental problem with the way we do community engagement that does not include future community members, because you only engage the current ones who block and have this adversarial conversation. And you know, for a long time, I am trying to have this conversation of quality over quantity. Like, why it became that height is the most, you know, the peak of the tension, and the city sees itself as the mean of protecting the public, of focusing the discussion around height. Why not the quality? Yes, we could have more height. We want affordable, we want larger units. This is the things that we actually need. Height is not what will break it in this case. And the problem was with inclusionary zoning, something that the province is trying to lead and the city is trying to lead, not yet approved, by the way, is that with inclusionary zoning, they said, oh, we're going to have 10% affordable. But they were not willing to give up, not to have any additional height, and not, you still need to comply with all the city's guidelines, 750 square meters, the angular plane, this is what determines the height. On top of it, 10% affordable housing, which means one thing, that 90% will be less affordable. We're taxing the 90% instead of saying affordable housing is something that we should carry as a society. That is inclusionary zoning, and it's the perfect example of how we have the cake and eat it too, or whatever you say that.
Yeah, it's the carrot and stick approach, right? The carrot is the incentive, and the stick is the you know, bad developer, bad whatever. I think there's too much stick, and so then we end up. And the other problem I would say is, in spite of all our efforts, John, and all of our efforts in planning everything, is that we've actually created false narratives and false scenarios where people look at it. Like I showed that zoning map at Broadview and Danforth. And Broadview is zoned at 14 meters, right? So everyone knows it's probably 4 stories. Danforth is zoned at 16 meters, which might be 5 stories. This is as of right, absolutely absurd on a subway line when you're trying to average, a 2.5 to 3 times is generally what you need to support running a subway effectively. So we're subsidizing these things because we're not actively planning. And people, there's educated people. There's always 1 or 2 that come to the public meeting and they know how to read a zoning bylaw. They're like, the height is 14 meters. I got you. You're asking for 20. You're so greedy. Well, what are you going to do? And we baseline our materials because we don't want to have the education and the conversation around, hey, this should not be this. This is a 40-year-old bylaw that just is a political and popularity contest. No one wants to go out on a limb. We need to break that. And I mean, the other thing I was just going to say is about politics. Politics of those hard decisions. We have a system that rewards politicians for not making those hard decisions. There's a few now trying to do, stand up and realize, but I think what's really been rewarding is they can now point to provincial requirements, which I've seen a little bit of a tone shift, like for example in the City of Toronto, where councillors are now starting to get it, where they say, well, we have to grow, so how are we going to grow? Versus we don't want your application because it's more than 14 meters, or we don't want to deal with, a comprehensive secondary plan because we don't want that. So I think there's a direct connection with our political timelines and, the quest for getting rehired, revoted, elected, sorry. Like, you get to do a bit of work for a year, and then you've got to start thinking 2 or 3 years, you're starting to think about re-election, and you're starting to, tone down what you might advocate for.
That complexity of, I sometimes think of it as the complexity in planning and building and all the hidden stuff that you were talking about with that little ziggurat building, and you're like, most of the public doesn't understand that at all. I write about this stuff, but my partner is an urban planner for a GTA city, and I'll often ask questions, what is this? And it'll be explained to me, and I'll be like, what? And I'm not trained in it, but I pay a lot of attention to it, and I still don't know. And I think of it almost like the medical profession, right? But however, doctors, people tend to put their trust in them more, but there's less trust in our kind of industry here. And Nama, you mentioned, you said kind of, we did it to ourselves, right? It's sort of the industry's own fault. And I was walking across here from the hotel, and there's a big sign for 2 condos, kind of swervy condos, and it says luxury on it. And I've often wondered if marketing is different than building and designing, but it's part of it. If we would stop calling everything luxury, every tiny little box in the thing luxury, so would maybe that help if to give a kind of broader acceptance of this, Like even people in houses, $2 million houses, will point at a condominium, a shoebox condominium, and say, look at that luxury thing coming, when they have a backyard and a front yard, and those people won't.
I was just about to say that the other word that we should take out of the lexicon is the shoebox. These are the other ends of the same problem. The developers calling it luxury, and then people, with a tone of critique, mostly to the developer, not to the people who live there, call it the shoebox, which I hear a lot. Also, when I moved to Canada, I also heard the term a lot, shitty condo, and I was asking, is that an official term? Why so many people say shitty condo for every time that they say condo? So we have a lot of cultural bias to the way we describe housing, work on housing, designing housing, and it all comes down also to the lack of family-friendly units. You know, I always say there aren't any backyards in Paris, and you would probably be okay with raising your kids in Paris, right? It's a beautiful city the last time I checked. And we have this cultural bias against, you know, raising your family in a condo. I have this constant argument with people. You know, more than 50% of Torontonians were not born in Toronto. Outside of North America, people live in apartments in a 3, 4, 5, you know, bedroom, decent. It's not just about the size, because obviously size is, and what, you know, Robert and Christian showed, related to construction and being sold per square foot. So it's not just about size, but it's about addressing the needs of family. And I always give this comparison of me and my best friend, where we were looking for a home at the same time. And I ended up buying a 3-bedroom in Toronto, and she ended up buying in the suburbs. She also ended up paying more than 25% more than what I paid, because these are the houses, you know, that you can buy in the suburbs. But you know, people say, oh, Toronto is not affordable. I'm priced out, I can't live here. So we need to make sure that A, those options exist, and B, that we are making sure that the lifestyle that Toronto has to offer, the suburbs cannot compete with what the city has to offer. No work from home environment will convince us otherwise. And we need to make sure that we have enough of housing choices for people to choose from.
John?
We have a sort of maxim, one of the maxims we work with is that the success of any project is directly proportional to how much you understand the people in the area you're building, or how your client, a larger public client. And I mean, that sounds sort of obvious, but actually you're doing an analysis of the existing zoning, but you need an analysis of, you know, what do people want there? You know, you need to talk. It's anthropology, which brings me to the point that we're sitting here again at an architects conference, and I think that it's high time. My grandfather was a surveyor, and my aunt gave me a picture of his graduation of 20 guys sitting around on some 1897 in U of T, and it said, "Did something wrong with this picture?" I said, "It says SBS, you know, School of Practical Sciences." He was an engineer, like he wasn't. There's some weird thing, and I looked up, oh, a School of Practical Science. Oh, that was a faculty that every university had, were planning, architecture, surveying, all the arts and sciences required to make a building or a town plan, or were in one faculty. And I think the other day I went to a thing for the OALA held, which invited architects to come, and a bunch of other people, and talk about housing. We were all there at that talk too. That is really important. And I think we got to go back to that and work together. And we need an anthropologist on every team to tell us, we think we know what's going on, we haven't a fucking clue. Seriously. And the more you look, the more you learn.
Robert and Christian, you are procurers of architecture, and we are in a room of architects. What can architects do? I mean, this is such a complex problem. You've got planners involved, you've got politics, a lot of politics, and you have all these different societal factors. But what can an individual architect, either small firm, individual, or even a big firm, one of the monsters, what would you like to see from the industry to kind of address this? Is there any kind of designy things that they could come with that could change this conversation?
I don't think they can do much, to be honest with you. You know, we're working with architects currently on the design of our next building in Regent Park. We've, The architects are doing the best that they can to make a building that's as efficient as possible, that is affordable to TCHC as possible. That gap that I showed between average housing price and average household income is so big. It's so big. We can tweak it. We can, shave off a few dollars here and a few dollars there, and to make things more affordable. We can tweak policies a little bit. For example, I know that some people have suggested maybe taking away HST on housing. On housing construction products, that'll help a little bit, but that's a policy decision by government elected officials. It's not a decision that architects have purview over. Policy decisions are, I think, where the biggest difference is going to come. It's out of the hands of architects. And even after most of those policy decisions have been made, if they are made, I think that even then, if it's true that, as economists say, that household income is tied to productivity, then the issues really are far, far deeper than whether or not we're charging HST on construction products or how much the development charges are on a piece of land.
I would say I understand that comment at a macro level. I would agree. It's very challenging to control the variables individually, given the scope of what you're trying to do as an architect. But I do think there's an opportunity to, and I've had the benefit of working with some really terrific ones in my career. And the ones that I think are the most successful are the storytellers. And they're the ones that tell the story, create the vision, and understand the framework they're working in, and can bend it to their will a little bit. And that doesn't mean you're going to rezone a site with no effort, and you're not going to, some people just won't buy the story. But the ones that I've seen are most successful, understand a bit about economics, right? They come with their developer hat on and understand the basics of development. And they understand that, a lot of the trends in architecture are that I see, at least in bigger buildings in particular, it's maybe the current trend is about pairing balconies and creating shape using balconies. Another trend might have been, in the past was about colored glass, or whatever the current trend is. You walk around the cities and see, I walk around here and hold my tongue, because there's a different kind of expression happening in buildings here. It's a very specific thing. But I think that the more you understand about economics and about planning, the number of times I've gone and spoken with architects who don't understand the planning context, or pair with someone, bring that person to the table and educate yourself, so you can come in and say, well, this doesn't make sense, or here's the context we're living in, but this makes no sense, and here's some other things that we think we can do. Here's why it would be great. And walk the developer through a vision of together, then create the story for the neighborhood. When you go to the neighborhood, it's about the narrative of what you're doing. You're not just there to maximize, most developers are not there to maximize potential. Like I never want to leave something obvious on the table, but I'm always there to hear about what's needed, and we have our own programmatic thing. The other thing we were talking about is this bad, profit. Working for profit is like a bad, is often considered like a bad word. It's not something talked about, that we're here because we're just interested in doing a good thing. I think the two can be synonymous. There's a give and take for everything. The challenge is the give and take. At least personally as a developer, I feel that often the affordable housing problem feels like it's a developer problem. it's pushed on like, well, you guys then need to create you guys should be doing more affordable housing because we have a systematic problem. And to me, my pushback on that would say, this is a collective problem, this is a societal problem, this is a political problem, a social problem, that we are in the driver's seat certainly of producing something that's needed, but we need cooperative help, and we need to stop being looked at as the enemy of, well, you better, inclusionary zoning, you're saying, is basically trying to be implemented like a tax. Do what you were doing before, but now add this with no other incentives. Well, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And that's why it's under appeal.
So I think you're worried about the story, but I think you need to hear the story too.
Yes.
And hear it. I mean, their story. And I think if I've asked people their story in TCHC, and they say, our story is, we've got 8 people in a 2-bedroom unit because they got pushed out of the shelters and they're here. But it's okay because we took over the empty parking lot in the basement and we're baking pita. We introduced pita bread to Toronto. So I just think the story thing is really, really important.
Yeah.
But what is their story? What is the incomplete? What's incomplete? Really? And because it's always changing.
Yeah.
So what is the story about the change, the next realm of change? Not the profits of it, it's just what's the right thing to do.
Yep.
I don't.
Sean, just to go back to Sean, your question today, and I'm sure you're aware, City Council is debating the major streets policy, and you ask what architects can do. I am very anxious to know the result of the voting today because my team went to the Planning and Housing Committee, and if I wasn't here today, I was in council trying to advocate for the major street policy to pass. The major street is allowing up to 6 stories or 30 units in the neighborhood's major streets. So think of streets like Dufferin, Lansdowne, and Christie that currently have single-family houses. That's all you can do there, and the major street policy should allow the 6 stories, 30 units as of right. And councillors in planning and housing started debating excluding streets in their wards from this policy.
Of course.
And the major streets is not like a random thing. It's a map in the official plan that identifies what the major streets are. So if to answer your question, there is one thing that architects can do, and it's make sure that we are showing up in council, showing up in those opportunities and say, we need major streets. We need these things.
But also look back at that neighborhood before, when it was empty, when it was created, and how it's changed and what's happened there.
What has changed, John? What has changed in those neighborhoods in the last 4 decades? Not enough.
Are you kidding?
No, no.
I mean, they've even changed. The only place they haven't changed is the
yellow.
No. Well, the yellow is another. There's lots of changes in there. There's lots of rooming houses in there. We know illegally. We know there are all kinds of things going on in there that we think.
But it's not an apparent change for a global city like Toronto.
No, but you've got to show people that we're in an evolution, and nobody ever goes back to the beginning to say, hey, this neighborhood used to be single-family homes. Now it's this. Now it's this. Cabbagetown was poor housing for Irish immigrants where they could grow their food. Oh, and then it became, they built a little house with their garden. Oh, we got cabbage. Oh, now they can't afford to live there because all the houses have been enlarged and cost $1 million bucks.
So you see, it's a totally uncontentious topic of our time. We have about 10 more minutes. We have time for audience questions. I wanted to read one pre-audience question one of you sent in before we get to you, so get your question ready. We know what the challenges are, historical and present. We know what to do, and now there is money to do it. But how and when will this process happen? We are mostly sitting on our hands now. What can we do to light the spark, so to speak?
Get together with your neighborhood and talk about the planning for the neighborhood. Talk about its history, talk about where, and come forward with your ideas to the city. And the city should ask for that.
I think we should dramatically increase funding, but tie it to what's kind of been interesting. So I'm working in Kingston a lot because that's where we were sorted and developed a lot of buildings. We often build a lot of buildings that students are living in near Queen's University. That's sort of where we started. And one interesting thing that I think is that, you know, I don't agree with a lot of the things that are happening at a provincial level, but one of the things they've done that I think is good is they've incented municipalities with growth targets. And if they hit or exceed those targets, they get supplementary, I think it's grants or some sort of income to help them continue to manage growth, right? And it was actually quite interesting because it changes the conversation at a municipal level and as well with the elected officials. They, you know, and I want to be clear, like I don't believe we should just grow everywhere and do whatever we want, right? This is not that conversation, but this is about a public education. And what I've seen in Kingston, as an example, Kingston has a great planning department, let's say that first. But they come to the table and say, how can we, you know, Podium, you guys have been doing a great job. How can we help, how can we have a conversation instead of what I often get in the city, Toronto is, you know, it's 6 months to have a conversation and then it's very adversarial and cautious. And it's because there aren't enough people and there aren't enough people tasked with actually doing the things that John's talking about, which is let's talk to the people and figure out what they think is special about their neighborhood. There isn't enough people to actually publicly educate. So take what they think is special and then say, well, we have a mandate to do other things. How can we actually plan ahead and create less barriers to things happening, right? Why are developers not doing much? Well, part of it is the system. Part of it is they're looking for opportunities. So all the taller and the aggressive buildings that are way over zoning are in those, you know, 10% of the land uses that aren't controlled. So I think that that's kind of an interesting thing that we can do is to say, let's talk to people, but let's also educate them on the decisions we're making, right? Like the fact we're building a new highway across Bradford, to me, is shocking. It's shocking that we're doing that through the Greenbelt. And you know, I'm an urbanist, obviously, so you know, I don't believe in perpetuating sprawl, but I think it's shocking that we're doing that at the same time.
And that highway costs more than the Ontario line.
I think that there are signs that things are being done. I don't want to sound partisan, but Mayor Chow seemed to have been a great catalyst, the right person at the right time, that the housing crisis got to a point where now every government seems to be tripping over themselves to try to try to look like they're addressing the housing crisis. And so suddenly there's a lot of money being made available. As an agency of the City of Toronto, TCHC is being directed to really ramp up our construction efforts. A lot of money is being thrown at us. So there are some signs of positive change. You know, in the 90s, the federal and provincial governments got out of the business of public housing. Now they're getting back into it in a kind of an arm's length way, in that they're funding it. They don't want to build it and own it like they used to. They're giving money to the City of Toronto to do that. So there are some positive signs for sure. It's just slow to get it.
We got a question over by the door there, and then one up at the front.
Caitlin. I'm concerned about, I'd like to go back to Broadview and Danforth and major streets, because Chris just gave major streets policy a kick in the head. Because Broadview is the major street, the boulevard planning, and to John's point, I'm 3 generations from that intersection. My great aunt lived in a boarding house on Plater, my other great aunt on Bowden. My grandparents had 13 people in a semi, various and sundry relatives. Eventually, we moved to a single family on Plater. They spent years working with the community, developing that major street up Broadview and across the Danforth. And it may be not perfect, but it is the missing middle. It is a good massing model. And I'm concerned that we as a profession are kicking out something that was good. Chris did a bit of it today. I mean, that was John Sievenpiper's site. That's the past president developing his own property. And maybe he's doing it because he believed in that. Certainly, once we pass it, like, it's upright, you should get going on it. But the other thing is, I hear people talking about, oh, poor housing. Let's use that model but make it square. We can't afford to have the setbacks. They're to make the streets sunny. We're throwing on the poor people or the affordable housing people, and we're saying for them we have to make ugly buildings. So I think what we should be doing here today is supporting one thing that the city has done well and not be kicking it in the teeth.
Anyone want to take that one on? Or?
Yeah, I can try.
Nama?
I actually agree with you, and I wrote an article not just about those urban design guidelines, but also the sustainability measures that want to exclude balconies altogether. And in a city that we, appreciate the backyard so much, are we in a right point to also exclude balconies because of their thermal and energy efficiency? And with the mass timber needs to be a box. I agree with you. We're walking into one direction, but walking backwards on all the things that we as urban designers and architects fought so hard to achieve. What you said about the sunny streets, if that was the true cause, we had different guidelines for north and south sides of the streets, and we don't. And I agree with you, there are things that we should really protect. Sunlight on parks, on sidewalks, we should identify that. But the truth is that we are now, as a society, prioritizing someone's backyard to have this direct sunlight and taking that angular plane and saying, okay, you cannot exceed that height because someone's backyard needs to have a sun. And it's a debate that we, I think, as a society should ask ourselves, is this the right moral decision to have? There's an application on Ossington. I don't know who the developer is. I don't remember if it's 16 or 19 stories. Either way, let's assume 19 stories. The City of Toronto, on Ossington, on the subway, the City of Toronto says this is not appropriate height on Ossington because of an angular plane abutting backyard. It's a question we should ask ourselves. Especially in winter, the sun is so low that even low-rise neighborhoods cast a shadow. So we have this, debate around shadow. I agree with you on the guidelines. We should design beautiful buildings, beautiful city, and we know that this box is walking backwards on some aspects. Definitely, I agree with you.
We have probably time for one more question. You're the only one I can see right now with the lights. So and maybe try to make it quick.
Well, it's hard. My name is Stephen Kirschenblatt. I am a member of this association for 46 years. And I've lived this experience of housing. I've lived and learned it over time. And I was feel lucky that I was able to learn it over that long time. The young people that are in this profession now have an undaunting task of understanding, learning planning, learning the approval process, learning energy efficiency, learning everything that goes into building the housing that we need today. I feel somewhat sorry for them. It's a very challenging experience. But in terms of housing, we have two problems. One is supply and one is affordability. And Robert addressed the affordability, that spread between income and the cost of housing. Architecture is never going to get it. On the supply side, architects may have an influence over the process and the speed of approvals and the influence of it. Somewhere along the line, architects lost their credibility at City Hall. City Hall learned not to trust the architect, not to trust the applicant's consultant team, and created a bureaucracy of people to challenge and look at all the work that we submitted, that we were requested to submit. So all that has taken time, all that has added cost to the process, and so could architects help to manipulate that process? Maybe. The bold initiatives, NUMA has identified huge growth potential within the city. How to make that growth happen? She has no answer, okay? And the answer is, and the problems that I see, especially Chris mentioned, Danforth, Broadview, bunch of streets, major streets with 20-foot properties owned by individual owners that all know that if they just sit on that land, it will be worth more and more. They will never sell it. They will never let it accumulate. Are we ready for a bold initiative like expropriation of major streets, where the province, especially around transit, where the province and the city see the public good in assembling large property and taking the risk away from developers and actually letting then developers come back and make proposals to build whatever density we want on it. 6 stories,
question?
10 stories, 12 stories. I'm sorry, this is more of a big problem, and I don't know whether anybody wants to address it. You don't have to, but all of these initiatives and the bold changes that we need are not being done. This association doesn't want to deal with it. Architects cannot challenge City Hall because we work with City Hall. We work with planning staff. We need them on our side. We need their support. Very difficult for architects to become proponents of change and confront the process. Councillors at City Hall have huge power. We need them on our side. We cannot challenge or confront them. It's a huge problem for all of us, and I don't know whether anybody wants to speak to it. You've spoken, I think, very nicely to all of us, but it's an immense problem, and we need to get bold initiatives to make it happen. Affordability will only be through social housing, nonprofits, co-ops, community housing, and that's where all the focus of government should be in the short term to create the affordable housing that we need today. And that's the only answer. There is no profit out of it. Entitlements taken out of it. Land, government land, is the only track forward, and we all should get behind that kind of movement.
Maybe a way to wrap it up really quick is 10-second answers. You are the premier of Ontario, which means you are the de facto mayor of every city because they have all the power. What is the first policy you would do? 10 seconds. What would you try to address this?
I would address that income line. I agree with you. We should put more money into social housing. However, not that I'm biased. However, be prepared to pay more taxes. Are you willing to do that?
Yeah. Christian? Jeopardy sound.
I think I would mandate changes to the Planning Act to create a more conducive, inclusive dialogue, but also an education piece. I really believe that while we need to listen, we also need to explain the trade-offs for decisions. And to that woman earlier, I just want to say, I was confronting a macro problem, so I understand, but I think that's, when you zoom out and say, at a macro level, this is the challenge we have.
No.
10-second answer. Focus on transit. Don't waste my time about triplex versus fourplex. focus on transit, kind of what you said. I just came back from Washington. In Washington, the private sector provides and builds affordable housing because of tax incentives, so it is doable.
Yeah.
10 seconds, Sean?
Oh.
10 seconds, go. What if you're the premier?
Mayor John?
Sorry, I lost my train of thought there.
It's okay. We're out of time anyway.
I mean, the richest part of the city today is the part that was built before 1950. That's the blue. And that's a lesson, because that part of the city has been changing over time, evolving. Planning came into being in urban planning to freeze things as they were. And here we're sitting fighting it.
Thank you.
We're paying, it's absurd. We know cities change. We've watched our own city change. We've watched every neighborhood change. That's what I say you need to talk to people about. Like, look at how that changed and what had happened. You know, nobody in my neighborhood
What
knew.
happens is that they open a WhatsApp group, and what they mostly do is they talk among themselves how they can prevent more development from happening, not how let's come together and
No,
discuss
that's
how
not
we can
true.
welcome.
That's not true.
Ask Christian, he showed me that WhatsApp.
Yeah.
We're ending, well, this whole thing has been a little pessimistic, but also it makes me happy again because we are actually talking about it at this high level, and smart people are talking about it and arguing about it a bit, whereas 7 years ago, it felt like you were talking into the wind and no one cared, and you have different levels of government beating each other over the stick about housing, whether that's the right thing or the wrong thing. It's happening. It feels like we have stuff to work with. So thanks to the OAA for starting this important conference by talking about this most important thing, and to all of you for hanging out in our wonderful panel.